One or two more questions, I suppose.
Okay. I'd just like to pick up on your last comment on social revolution, and I'd like to know what you mean won by a social revolution and what it would take. And I have another question, actually my original question, which is what do you think of Neil Postman's book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, in which he argues that the media and the mass, especially television, has reduced Americans' ability to think rationally because of the way that the information is given to them. In other words, he's arguing that before before the media really became very rapid with commercials and everything, people read more and were more able to tie their thoughts together.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, let's start with the second one again. I think there's a lot to what Neil Postman says. Remember, I started off by saying I was going to talk about the elite media, the agenda-setting media. I mean, roughly speaking, this is an oversimplification, but as a first approximation, we want to distinguish two categories of citizens. We want to distinguish what's sometimes called the political class from the rest. The political class is the upper middle class, educated, articulate, politically active, went to the good colleges. They're going to be able to participate in management, whether it's corporate management or state management or ideological management. And I include in that things like teaching and so on. That's one sector, small sector of the population. Then there's the rest of those slobs out there who are just supposed to be turning screws and that sort of thing. Now that's as a start. That's not the whole story. It's more differentiated than that, but that's a start. Now they're treated differently in the media. The first group, they're treated differently in the schools. It's been studied, in fact. For the slobs, the 80% or whatever they are, the main thing for them is to divert them, to get them to watch National Football League and to worry about, mother with child with 6 heads or whatever you pick up in the, in the thing that you pick up on the supermarket stands and so on. Or to, look at astrology or get involved in, fundamentalist stuff or something, or just get them away, get them away from things that matter. And for that, it's important to reduce their capacity to think, because they're just supposed to follow orders, basically. Now, you have to remember, it's not very far back that there was a live working class culture in the United States. I mean, I'm just old enough, they're just about old enough to remember. The most educated people I ever met in my life were Jewish working class people in New York in the 1930s. Most of them never went to school, but they read, they went to concerts, they had arguments, they had debates. That's where I learned most of everything I know. Some of them never got past 4th grade, meaning less indoctrination. But it was a live, ongoing, working class culture. It took a long time to destroy it. In other countries, it still hasn't been destroyed. The United States is more advanced. So let's say in England, like when I last time I was in England a couple months ago, I gave a talk. Here, when I give a talk on these topics, either in a university or a church or something like that, in England, one was in a town hall, the other was in a guild hall. Well, that's, a union hall. That's out of the question. The concept doesn't exist. The reason is that England still has the residue of a working class movement. Until the 1960s, it had a very lively working class press, daily press, which more people read than read the elite press, and was good, serious newspapers, presented a different conception of the world day after day after day, different values, different conception of the right that people have to their product of their own labor, to their right to participate in what happens in the world, international affairs, everything. Just a different value system, a different morality, different interpretation. Well, that succumbed to market forces, basically to market forces, and I talked about before. In the United States, it happened a long time ago. In other European countries, they're kind of more backward. It'll take them a while longer to reach the U.S. system of sort of depoliticization, one political party, no structured media to prevent dissent. That's more sophisticated. And what you're saying, what Postman is saying and what you're saying, I think is very right. I mean, a large part of the media are in fact directed to that. But don't forget that the managers have to understand things. Now, the people who are running the corporations have to know how to make more or less rational decisions. And the people who are running the state have to know how to serve the interests of the people with private power. You need the people who are experts in Kissinger's sense, who know how to articulate the consensus of the powerful and serve their interests. And the people who are writing the editorials have to sort of understand things, and the journalists have to do it, and so on and so forth. Now, they have to do it within a particular framework. You don't want them to think too much. You want them to think within fixed bounds, but they've got to be able to think, and there's real contradictions there, incidentally. You see the contradictions in the universities very strikingly. So, for example, in the natural sciences, it's extremely hard to be dishonest and uncreative. I mean, you've got nature out there keeping you honest, You can do a false experiment, but somebody's going to catch you up in no time because nature is out there. You write a false book about the French Revolution, you can do it forever, Nobody's going to stop you until ideological changes take place. You can tell these fabrications about modern contemporary history, and as long as power is on your side, it doesn't matter. Because as long as power is on your side, it's the illusions that are real and the reality that's irrelevant. It's actually true as long as power is on your side. You don't have nature out there keeping you honest. And you see a difference. I mean, you just see a difference in the intellectual culture, But the point is in the kind of ideological side of the culture, the humanities and social sciences and so on, you still have to be able to think. At the same time, you have to be able to not think, because if you think too much, you come up with the wrong idea. So there's a delicate line that has to be drawn, and it's a tricky one to keep. The universities and the schools and so on have their problems with it, and the universities do too. The newspapers do too. The point is there are conflicting values. There's the value that says you better tell the truth, for one thing because you've got some professional integrity, and for another thing because people in power have to understand the real world. On the other hand, there's the pressure that says you better not tell the truth, because then you're going to see things wrongly, you're going to undermine illusions and so on and so forth. And those are real conflicts, and you can play on them. Within limits, you can play on them. So I think he's right, but only about part of the media. And I happen to be talking about the other part primarily. So what we're saying is kind of complementary. As for a social revolution, you can't give a pat answer to that. But, it's a hard problem, and that's not just another talk, but a lot of talk. The question is, what do we think is a just society? Now, the United States is founded on a principle, the one that is expressed by the Founding Fathers. The people who own the country ought to govern it. They said it straight out, because those were nice, open, honest days. We don't say it. We just have it built into everything. Those who own the country ought to govern it. And that's sort of what happens. Wherever you come from, ask who your congressional representative is. Take the House of Representatives, which is the most representative part of the government, and ask yourself who your representative is. And chances are you're going, and ask what that representative is going to do if he, or less likely she, is voted out of office, which is a very rare event since we basically have a one-party system with no replacement. But suppose it happens, what are they going to do? Is that person going to become a truck driver, or a grocery store clerk, or a farm laborer, or assembly line worker, or something like that? Chances are no. Chances are that person's going to go back to work in a corporate law office, or some managerial position, or somewhere else in the state system, or something like that. Maybe a professor at a university or something. But one of the tiny, narrow, elite professions. And that means that's who they're representing. Now, that was a live issue in the 18th century. Very live issue. That was a live issue in the years after the American Revolution. You take a look back at the struggles at the time of the Articles of the Confederation and federalism and so on, and those were some of the issues that were being fought about. The question was, are people going to be represented by people like themselves? Or are they going to be represented by the gentry, the aristocrats, the rich, and so on? Well, the Federalists won. Even despite their electoral defeat, they basically won. People were represented by the rich. The same thing happened in the English Revolution of the 17th century. In fact, it happens in every revolution. You take a look at any revolution you want, you'll find conflicts among elites And then you've got this mass of a population that wants to get rid of all of them, and they usually lose. And one or the other of the elite groups takes power. They can call themselves Bolsheviks or some other thing. But one or another of the elites takes power, and the general population, the kind of radical Democrats, usually lose. They may not lose everything, like they make some gains, but they don't gain the right to be represented by people like themselves, to have direct participation, to eliminate the very notion of coercion and power. They don't, so far in history, they haven't gained that. And that's what a social revolution would be, I think. It would be realizing the actual ideals of the Enlightenment and of the early revolutionary period, meaning that the very idea of people being forced to rent themselves in order to survive is obscene. Not as bad as being forced to sell yourself to survive, but it's not all that different. That was understood a century or two ago. It can be understood again. The idea that that the role of a person in a political system is to ratify decisions made by others. That's unacceptable in a real democracy. The idea that you have to select among the narrow class of people who own the country or their representatives and that's what political participation means, I would think that should be unacceptable in a political system. And changing all of those things would be a social revolution. It would mean taking control over the fundamental decisions of the society, whether they're decisions over production or distribution or consumption or governance or whatever, and making them authentically popular in popular groupings, whether they're in the workplace or the community or other arrangements and so on. Now, exactly how that should look like, well, there it becomes not so simple. But it seems to me those are the directions in which a radical democratic revolution would move, and it's not something particularly novel. This means reconstructing ideals which always show up in popular struggles, and have been doing it for centuries. One more?
I'm sorry, I just wanted to ask, this is, first of all, if I stay, I want to explain that this is the first time I ever heard you speaking, so some of my thinking might be a little bit naive or facile. But a lot of the basic examples and discussions that you've talked about tonight are sort of a big version, big, mature, sophisticated, and quite important version of saying that, Santa Claus doesn't exist, and, faith is no good, and intellect is, and rationale is good. And what I was wondering was, of course, you see intellect and rationale as beyond faith, as something out there. Reality is outside of what we're living in. And it just seems to me, I just wonder what your agenda is, because although you deny, you think that basically the right to exercise power by states outside of their national boundaries, it seems to me, is legitimate. And yet you're saying that the method of sort of pacifying the domestic population is not. But what I'm wondering then is your agenda then merely to sort of expand the number of people inside the government, or inside the country rather, who can participate in that decision-making process of exercising power? In other words, are you, by speaking about these sorts of things, talking about if we have a government here that is ruled by people who own something in the country, are you claiming then that you have a right to claim a piece of intellectual property, which gives people in this room as well who gain intellectual property a right to have exercise influence within that government as it projects its power overseas?
I'm not sure I understood that, to tell you the truth. I didn't think feasible if people do something about it. Now, as far as the agenda is concerned, well, it starts narrow and it goes up. The narrowest point, I wouldn't bother doing this unless I meant what I said. What I said is, I urge you to look at the facts and see if this sketch is right or if something else is right. So that's what I'd like to do. I'd like to convince people to try to figure out what's going on. That's the lowest thing. Just urge people to figure out what's going on. I tell you what I think's going on. I don't own any intellectual property, incidentally, Anybody else can say what they think is going on in the kind of society I'd like to see. Like, for example, the reason I repeat that I urge you to check the documents is I'm not even trying to persuade you. Just like when I teach a graduate course, I'm not trying to persuade the students. I mean, that's maybe what you do in a theology course or something. But if you're teaching a graduate course in the sciences, you're not trying to persuade your students, at least if you're any good or you know what you're up to. You're trying to get them to be able to figure out what's going on. And you know perfectly well you're probably wrong because you've always been wrong in the past, and so has every other scientist been wrong in the past. So you're trying to get them to figure out what's going on and correct your errors and do it better and so on. Same here. I mean, I'm not trying to persuade you that this is right, but I want to get you to think about it, to convince you that it's worth thinking about, figure out what's right. If you do, I think you're going to find something like what I said, but maybe not. So that's the lowest concern. Second concern is that after you figure out what's right, you're going to want to do something about it. And there are a lot of things that can be done. We've just been talking about that. I think there are a lot of people suffering in the world, here and elsewhere. We've been talking about a few of those problems, plenty of others. Many of the people who are suffering because of us. Now, there's a lot of things we can't do much about. Like somebody raised the question of Lebanon. Frankly, I said I have no suggestion. I don't know what we can do about it. Maybe somebody else does, but I don't. There are things happening in many places I don't think we can do much about. Some things we can do a lot about because we're primarily responsible. So, for example, the failure of diplomatic settlement in the Middle East, we are primarily responsible for that, I think. That's what I think you're going to discover if you check the record. And if that's the case, and a lot of people are suffering from that. In fact, the world may blow up because of a very threatening situation, quite apart from the local victims. If that's in fact the case, there's a lot that we can do about it. And I'd like to see people do it. Same with regard to Central America, which I mentioned. You know, where there's hundreds of thousands of people have been slaughtered down there in this last decade. That's because of you and me, not Mars. You know, we let it happen. And we don't have to. We can do something about it. There are other things where it's less easy to do it. As for your general principle, I don't agree that states have a right to exert force across their borders. I really don't agree with that. And furthermore, see, if the word conservative, which in my view is an honorable word, if it hadn't lost its meaning entirely and been turned into its opposite, like peace process, we would recognize that to be a very conservative position. In fact, that's part of the supreme law of the land in the United States. If you're a law-abiding person, you just think we have a reasonably good system of laws, you agree that it's a war crime, kind of thing for which people were hanged at Nuremberg, for a state to exercise force beyond its boundaries. Therefore, it's kind of surprising that people think that's legitimate. I mean, was Hitler legitimate? That's what the Nazis were tried for exerting force beyond their boundaries. It was a post hoc decision, so you could claim it's fraudulent. And in fact, there's a lot of fakery about it. But the principles, which are enshrined in the UN Charter, which is a valid treaty and therefore the supreme law of the land, are very clear about this. You know, they leave some margin of debate, like anything does, but they're quite clear. They specify the cases where states, they begin by accepting the international system. Well, I think that's a transitory system. That ought to be improved. But let's begin by accepting it. Then it says, in that system, states are not permitted to use force, or even the threat of force. They're not even permitted to use the threat of force. And the only exception to that, there's only two exceptions to that. One is if authorized by the UN Security Council, like you can send peacekeeping troops to Namibia. And the other is in the case of armed attack. When you're directly attacked, like somebody crosses your border and begins attacking you, then you can use force up till the point where the Security Council acts. That's it. Anything else is illegal, kind of crime for which we hanged people at Nuremberg with lots of noble rhetoric about how the principles apply to us too. It's a conservative position to say we ought to obey our own laws. And to say blandly states have a right to exert force in international affairs is to say the Nuremberg trials were wrong. Wrong in principle. It's perfectly okay for Hitler and the Japanese to do what they did. It was a mistake to condemn them. I don't agree with that. There's a lot wrong with the international system and international law, but those things are right. And I think we ought to try to live up to them. We could play a constructive role in world affairs in theory, and if we could get our boots off people's necks, then we could start talking about how to do that. But to exert force or to carry out embargoes and that kind of stuff, that's just flat wrong. In fact, there's a World Court decision which the United States rejects because we're a lawless state, demanding that we stop the unlawful use of force. Kind of interesting that nobody cares about that because we take for granted that we're a lawless state. But I don't think we should.